Welcome to the third and final video of second monitor content I'll be making for Europa Universalis 5. After this, we'll have to wait until I get game access again before I can make any more EU5 videos. Now, just like the Greenland and Scotland videos, I can't show you any more actual EU5 gameplay footage, so instead you're watching me play some Norway in EU4 in the background while I use some screenshots from my 30-minute EU5 video and some additional images from the Tinto talks or other associated development threads. Unlike the Greenland or Scotland videos, though, I might have actually been the only person to play Norway in EU5 so far, or at the very least, nobody else has made any videos for Norway. And as such, I unfortunately don't have any recommended gameplay videos for you. Just like last time though, we'll be going over the geography, population, culture, economy, and expansion during my time playing as Norway. Not much this time for politics, but fortunately we will have a brief section about religion. As I showcased in my 30-minute video, I only played Norway up to 1423. It was the final run I did before making my Naples video, and I felt somewhat comfortable with most of the game mechanics by then. As isolated as Norway is, it felt like an easy and relaxed way to further explore economy building without the threat of war looming at every turn. As it turns out, I was wrong about that, but not in the way you'd expect. Despite that, Norway still gets my somewhat noob-friendly stamp of approval. Probably not your preferred first campaign, but maybe not bad for your fourth or fifth. In the end though, Sweden is probably just the easier pick anyway. Starting with the geography, as you'd expect, Norway is at least 80% a mix of mountains and hills. And just like with Scotland, you're generally not going to start with too many people living around those areas. There is one notable exception though, with the town of Nidaros, north of Oslo, but having sparse population in those areas is actually a good thing because of Norway's winters. Unlike with Scotland, Norway's winters are incredibly brutal. They did hamper my construction constantly. Even the more temperate parts of Norway are still affected for at least 3 or 4 months of the year, and at worst in the mountains I was experiencing around 7 months of halted construction per year. This means I had to pick my buildings carefully because I could be waiting several years for some of them to finish. Fortunately, there are some flatter grassland areas that are more temperate, where construction's more consistent, and they do coincide with a higher starting population anyway. Speaking of which, Norway's population is pretty small at the start of the game, with a modest population of 471,000 people. It's also not a very urbanized country either, meaning I had to put some real work into encouraging migration to the capital and other population centers in the south. Over time though, I did manage to get Oslo from 23,000 population to 36,000, which doesn't sound like much, but that's also after the Black Death hit and wiped out around a third of my population. By this point, I had experienced the Black Death in EU5 a couple of times, so I felt a little more confident dealing with it, which is to say that I built one hospital in Oslo, kicked out all of the sick, and prayed. There was no stopping it from reaching Norway since Denmark had a few locations in my market, and I didn't realize that at the time, so I did isolate my market, but that barely bought me a few months at best. Now, because Norway doesn't start with a very urbanized population, the death toll was better than it could have been, and Norway's sparsely populated territories actually do give you a slight advantage, and that's because you're able to build settlements. I think I've mentioned these in literally every EU5 video I've made so far. I love these things, if you can't tell. They give you a flat 1% monthly population boost wherever you build them, so you can slap down 20 of these things and they do make a pretty noticeable impact over time. The other big factor that helped with population recovery was asking other countries to send settlers. As I mentioned in my Greenland video, you do have to spend a few favors to get 10 population per month for a period of, I honestly don't remember, but I think it's 5 years. And because you start off in a personal union with Sweden, you can easily ally them to get passive favors over time. Likewise, you can ally up with Denmark and Scotland to ask them to send more people over. In Scotland's case, this only really works while they have the Isles as a subject, since that's the country you're actually going to be asking. If you do that enough times, you can easily get at least a few thousand additional pops over time. Although it's never really enough pops to significantly affect the cultural demographics of your country. Which was a bit of a forced segue, but anyway, let's talk about culture. The country is mostly Norwegian at the start, as you'd expect, but there are some Sami communities in the north. If I'm remembering correctly though, I don't think there are enough Sami pops in your country to tolerate or accept the culture. Similarly, even though I invited several thousand Swedish and Danish pops as settlers, they never made up enough of the population to accept or tolerate those cultures either. Of course, until I integrated Sweden, which then gave me the chance to integrate Swedish culture and of course gain a bunch of cores. By that point though, my population growth had put the number of Norwegian pops pretty close to the number of Swedish pops, which did put a bit of a strain on my cultural capacity, but did alleviate what could have been a worse problem. I think if I did manage to somehow gain control over Denmark and integrate them directly, there is a possibility that I could have unified the culture group and formed a Scandinavian culture, and that should open up some cultural capacity to allow you to accept some other cultures. Moving on to the economy, you'll probably notice something about the raw resources present in Norway, namely that it's 90% either lumber, wild game, or fish. As far as I can remember, this resource map appears to be consistent with the game version that I played. Now, I wouldn't blame you for thinking that this choice of raw resources makes Norway pretty impossible to play since you don't really have much to work with, but there are a few really important notable exceptions. For one, Oslo is a wheat province which was able to single-handedly feed a much larger urbanized population in and around Oslo itself. And secondly, it's easy to miss this, but there's actually one silver resource right here on your map. For those who are audio only, that's a little bit southwest of Oslo. So naturally, being the only raw resource that seemed to be of any significant value, I went all in on that silver. It's close enough to the capital that it gets reasonable market access, and it's not too difficult to send people that direction to try and make sure you can actually exploit all that silver. And once you maximize it, that thing prints money, obviously in the sense that you can literally mint currency from it, but also that you can make silver-based jewelry and make frankly unreasonable amounts of money. Jewelry ended up being the main export from my towns, and everything else became secondary to the goal of maximizing my jewelry production and export. Other than jewelry though, I was able to make and export lots of lumber products as well, stuff like tar and charcoal, although those are a little bit harder to make on a massive scale because they do take significantly more laborers and thus population to produce that kind of thing. As for the urban goods, I found both cloth and fine cloth, which you just make from cloth, are pretty decent exports. I did also end up making a series of towns in a line along the coast right around Oslo. Those locations each start with a little bit more population than the more rural ones and are close enough to the market capital that you can take advantage of both good market access and pretty high control from proximity. Since each town you build increases the number of markets you can build, I figured I should probably make a whole bunch of them and maximize my trade since it made me so much money. Creating this urbanized crescent, so to speak, also made it pretty easy to connect up the more important parts of my country with roads, since more of the population became concentrated in these towns, so I was able to get better access to taxation and manpower and that kind of thing. Those towns weren't made just to make a bunch of money though. I also found that I was running out of burgers to be able to actually start producing more industry. The population promotion speed in Oslo was not nearly enough to keep up with the demand for burgers, so if I wanted to further expand the jewelry industry, I had to make sure that I could have enough people to work in those industries. Now, I've been mentioning the Oslo market for quite some time, which might be confusing if you read the Tinto talks because the Oslo market is notably absent from any Tinto Talk screenshots. That's because there were markets for both Oslo and Stockholm. I honestly don't remember if I manually split off my Oslo market or if I started with it, but at the very least, Stockholm's was definitely there from the beginning, and at that point I had already realized just how important it was to have your own market as a country that's larger than maybe a handful of territories. This is where things got a little bit more complicated though, because I noticed I wasn't getting a lot of market access in the north of Norway. In fact, market access was getting really slim anywhere further than like the first couple of locations away from Oslo. So I came up with the idea of creating 2 new markets. I made one in Nidaros, that town that I mentioned at the start of today's video. It's the one that's north of Oslo. And then I created a second market in the far north of Norway. I decided to do this because I figured these locations had such little market access that they weren't really doing much trade with my main market anyway. And if they're not doing much trade with my main market anyway, is there really a point to them being in my main market? So that was the main reason behind deciding to make them. The one in Nidaros was definitely a lot more worth it than the other one in the far north. That's because Nidaros itself is a town, which means I was allowed to build marketplaces, and as such, it had some trade capacity to work with, since of course trade capacity is localized to markets. But the one in the far north I felt was maybe not the greatest of ideas. Sure, it was getting between 0 and maybe single-digit access at best, but because giving it its own market pretty much cut it off from all kinds of trade, I felt like there was a chance, even a small one, that I might have sabotaged some of those locations in the north. But because not much was happening up there anyway, I figured it wasn't a big deal. What was a big deal, actually, was the fact that building additional markets makes it kind of annoying to try and build buildings, because whenever you try to build a building, it is localized to a market. So if you want to figure out what's the best building, what'll make you the most profit right now, you can sort by how much profit it'll make you, but only within that one market. If you want to figure it out for the whole country, you have to scroll through your markets and compare each one, which I thought would be fixed by being able to automate buildings for specific markets. But when I tried that, I couldn't figure it out. I'm not sure if it's just not a feature yet, or if it's a feature that's not quite working, but I couldn't figure out a way to just locally automate building production. Because that would be nice for stuff like in the north or in Nidaros. Moving on to expansion and war, this was definitely the game that I expanded the most during, but not really because I was declaring a whole bunch of wars. Instead, I was constantly occupied with Sweden's wars. They would get themselves involved in several wars against Novgorod, all of which they called me into, and naturally, every time Sweden would get stomped, then I'd have to come to their rescue to try and fight to a stalemate. Originally, I was considering just letting them do whatever they want, but because we're in that union and I was trying to become the senior partner to eventually integrate them, I realized that Sweden's territory was actually my future territory. So I had no choice but to step in every single time. And each time Sweden would only take a single location or maybe some token concessions because I didn't want to sacrifice all of my working men in a series of pointless wars. Other than that, I did take a couple of locations in Ireland because I was afraid of missing out before England took everything, but that was pretty much the extent of any conquest that happened before forming Scandinavia. Speaking of which, if you watched my Naples video, you know exactly how this unfolded. Personal unions appeared to be incomplete at this stage of game development, or at the very least, I sincerely hope they are incomplete, because integrating a union is as simple as throwing money at it and waiting for a few years. I didn't receive any pushback from Sweden at all, but I did take my time before unifying the crowns anyway, because I was concerned with how much control I could even get over Sweden to begin with. It would kind of suck to integrate a union only to have to divvy up the territory into more subjects anyway, but in hindsight, despite how long I took trying to unify the crowns, I probably should have made subjects anyway, especially for Finland, which I maintained close to zero control over. After integrating Sweden though, I obviously formed the Kingdom of Scandinavia, which only required a certain number of locations within the Scandinavia region. Well, that was pretty neat, and it didn't force me to take over Denmark to form a unified Scandinavia tag. It does make me wonder if some location requirements would be a good idea. A united Scandinavia without Denmark feels a little bit odd, but I would be fine with that if Scandinavia were renamed to something like the Kingdom of Norway, Sweden, or something along those lines when you're missing Denmark. Personally, I'm a big fan of dynamic renaming, one of my favorite aesthetic additions to Victoria 3, so I think it would be cool if we get the opportunity to form the Kalmar Union if you start as Denmark, for example. Since I did form Scandinavia pretty late into how much I played, I didn't end up conquering too much after that, except for another major war against Novgorod. This was the point I realized that Sweden's annoying wars were probably due to an event that kept firing. I don't have enough evidence to prove this, but I did get an event that specifically started a war with Novgorod, and that was immediately after integrating Sweden, so of course I ended up having a border with Novgorod at that point. It's not a complete theory, but I do have a hunch. Now, I really did not do a great job of showing this off in my 30-minute video, since it only has like 30 frames dedicated to a point where you can see this, but here's a little bit of territory that I carved out in that war with Novgorod. Naturally, I gave all of that stuff away to a subject, because there's absolutely no way I was going to get any kind of reasonable control on territory that far away. Besides conquering and diplomatic annexation, I also got to experience a little bit of the colonization mechanics. Not significantly though, because Norway Norway and Sweden start the game off with a colonial treaty preventing overlapping colonization between the two. Once I formed Scandinavia though, I was able to push forward unimpeded. There really isn't much to say here except it might be worth it to turn these new territories that you colonize into subjects, only because it's a little bit rough to try and set up any kind of decent control in that area. However, you would get cores, so I don't know, it's up to you. And as a side note, I did notice in one of my other campaigns that the Sami Society of Pops did at least once become a landed country in the north of Scandinavia. I'm not sure how that affects the usual course of events because I think that was during my Portugal game, but I thought it was worth mentioning. I also mentioned at the start of today's video that there isn't really a politics section. That's because there isn't much to say for Norway's politics, or rather there isn't anything specific to Norway that I can actually remember, other than getting a reform that boosts proximity overseas and one that increased my crown power. Nothing stood out to me enough to actually remember it. That isn't to say that there's nothing unique for Norway, it's just that I don't remember finding anything unique. And unfortunately, I can't check anymore. Finally, we do get to talk about religion, and I decided to include that in today's video because I knew some of you would be pleased to hear that Norway does start with a handful of Norse religion pops. Not nearly as many as Sweden does, I think, but there is some presence. Unfortunately, I didn't check to see if you could spread the Norse religion with those pops as a starting base, so I'll have to look into that more when I get my hands on the game again. But at the very least, it gives me hope that one day, a Norse run may be possible in EU5. Otherwise, Norway is of course predominantly Catholic, especially in the south of the country, while in the far northern areas, Sami shamanism has a little bit more of a presence. I suspect, though, that they might revisit Scandinavia at one point, so the numbers might change on that. There might be more or fewer Norse pops, or they might even get rid of them entirely in Norway. Maybe they'll only exist in Sweden. In any case, that does bring us to a close for our Norway video for EU5. I'm looking forward to trying Norway again when I get the opportunity, to see how viable it is to have a colonial Scandinavia, see if I could push a little bit more into the British Isles that time around, and just maybe see if I could play a Norse Scandinavia. Thank you very much for watching, or listening in this case. This is normally the part I would say, go ahead and subscribe for more EU5 videos, but we're not going to get those for quite some time. If you're a fan of EU4 though, which I assume most of you are if you're looking into EU5 videos, then still subscribing's probably a good idea. And if you'd like to leave a like on the video, that would be hugely appreciated. For now though, this is Corbett signing off, and as always, have a fantastic day. I'd like to give a big thank you to all of the patrons for this month. Everyone here does get early access to videos for as low as $1, so I'd like to give a special thank you to those who decide to donate more than that anyway. So thank you Erica, Baby Cal, Born to Dunk, Le Quebecer, Nick Steffel, Q-Brute, Solo Isaac Only, A.G. Forero, Ben Modrum, Quiet Guy, Rosset, Torvalved, Ambient Cyan, James Levy, Luke78776, Stalin DLRP, White Rook, and Robert.